This was destiny, this was kismet, this was fate, and now it's time for me to make this video. In 2022, my friend and I decided to read all the Animorphs books as a fun little challenge for ourselves. I had read a few as a kid, but I never really gotten into the series, and I thought it would be fun to see what I had missed out on. By the end of that year, I had read all 54 books in the original series and 8 companion novels, and experienced the highs and lows, trials and tribulations of some preteen child soldiers who were also furries. And now you get to hear all about it. Why is this destiny? I had been planning this video for a long time now, almost 3 years, but had never actually made it. And then I was literally working on the script for this today, April 3rd, when I see this announcement from Variety magazine: Animorphs TV series in development at Disney+, Ryan Coogler's Proximity Media to produce. And I think it is finally time that everyone hears about the unknown, unexplored, ignored genius of Animorphs. You might be wondering, Animorphs, those books with the funny, weird covers done with Photoshop before the horrors of generative AI? Yeah, those books, but they actually were not that funny. I have seen some of the most convoluted, deranged, traumatic plots in science fiction history just in this collection of books that are marketed towards elementary school age children. This year, 2026, marks the 30th anniversary of the first book, which is The Invasion, and that book came out in June. To commemorate, I'm going to attempt to explain exactly why I find this series so captivating. I think the time when I read it, 2022, it was a year of great transition for me. I was graduating college, I was moving out of my home state, I was starting grad school in a new city, and it was sort of a coming of age. So reading this while experiencing that for myself, it was very amusing and also somewhat healing, because I was reading about this group of kids who had their own Bildungsroman. I think our circumstances were very different, obviously, but regardless of what they went through and what I went through, I think that everyone can resonate with these books. And hopefully by the end of this video, I will inspire you to read them as well. If I'm looking off to the side, it's because I do have a full, like 30-page Google Doc with my notes, so just ignore that. So what is the Animorphs about? The short version, Animorphs is about a group of 5 human kids who are bestowed with the technology to morph into different animals. They're given this ability in the first book after they accidentally walk into the crash site of a mysterious spaceship, and they watch this alien prince named Elfangor die a brutally horrific death. This is not a spoiler, this happens in chapter 6 of the books, and it kind of sets up the entire premise for the series. Before his death, Elfangor is able to communicate with these children and give them morphing powers. Then he's killed by an evil alien, Visser 3, and then this is the central villain in the series. Visser 3 is an alien from a species called the Yeerks, which will be very important. The Yeerks are trying to take over the universe through mind control. They're able to climb into brain spaces of various animals and species, all these different types of creatures, but they go through your ear canal and latch onto your brain and control you by manipulating electrical signals in your brain. So this basically means that they're a parasite and they take over a host. When we start this story, the Yeerks have already begun their attack on the humans of Earth, so they've started controlling people who are in power in local communities. Back to the 5 human kids who call themselves the Animorphs. They're given the morphing power because Elfangor has faith that they can stop Visser 3 and stop this war somehow. Thus, this begins sort of a guerrilla war between the 5 children and Visser 3, but also none of the Yeerks know about these kids' actual identities. They think they are part of Elfangor's fighting committee. I think that this is a story of very fantastical proportions, but it's also very serious, and there are real tragedies. By the end of the story, the Animorphs do win this intergalactic war, but I think they're changed for the worse, and the battles have really done a number on their psyches. Regarding the publication of this series, the books were largely written by author K.A. Applegate, or Catherine Applegate, but many of them were also co-written by her husband, Michael Grant, who's also a children's author, but I haven't read any of his books. There's also a large collection of books in the middle of the series, which were mostly written by Catherine's proteges or apprentices at the time. She did provide them with the overarching plot as well as how it would connect to the other books in the series and advance the plot, but she didn't write most of these. So I think they're effectively ghostwritten. I think some fans have more gripes with this aspect because as a ghostwriter, you can easily lose your character voice and maybe the tone of the book feels off or it reads more like a filler. But generally, I don't mind that much because if I was releasing one book on average every month for 3 years, I would probably have ghostwriters too. So that is the short summary of Animorphs. And from here on out, there will be major spoilers as I explain the long version. I'm not sure how many people still care about spoilers 30 years later, but if you still want to read them, there are definitely a lot of plot points that are more interesting and hit 1,000 times harder if you don't know about them going in. So don't say I didn't warn you. Major spoilers start now. So, Animorphs, the long version. First, I'll talk about the characters because I think while the plot is a big driver of the books are also told in first person, so you really actually get a feel for these children's personalities and motivations through their narration. Obviously, I can't go into detail of every single character, but I'm going to cover a lot of them, especially the ones that have major plots or are important to the overall war effort. I will be grouping them as the Animorphs, the aliens, the andalites, the antagonists, the allies, asterisk, and the architects. And yeah, it took me a long time to think about those names. So, the Animorphs. Like I said before, the Animorphs are the 5 children that the series centers on. I said 5, but there's actually 6 Animorphs, but one of them isn't a human. The books are actually told through these 6 rotating perspectives. So I'll introduce them in the order that they narrate the books. Jake is the only character whose last name is actually said in this series, which makes him the main character. He's in the first book. He is kind of the de facto leader of this group. He's described as a mediocre jock with mediocre grades. He can't make the JV basketball team in his middle school. He has nothing going for him, but he kind of accidentally becomes important because while he's average, he becomes the leader of the Animorphs, and now his life is serious. He is a 13-year-old general of this army, and he still has trigonometry class. He never signs up for any of this, but he has to really make some tough decisions, especially as the war goes on. By the end of this series, I would say his personality kind of takes a 180 because of all the stress and the pressure that he goes through. And I'll admit that he's not my favorite character, but I think his character development and arc is very interesting, especially how post-war his character is just completely different from what it is when you're introduced to him. So, side note number 1, while the Animorphs acquire many morphs throughout the series, they all have a preferred animal to fight with. So this is kind of why people joke that they're furries. This does become very significant later, so I will explain what all of the Animorphs' preferred morphs are. Jake's preferred morph is a tiger. So the next character is Rachel. Rachel is Jake's cousin, but they couldn't be more different. She is popular, she's blonde, she's athletic, she's smart, she's tall. She has everything going for her, basically the opposite of Jake. Except she has a secret, and it's not really a secret, but the secret is that she's bloodthirsty. She loves the war. She lives for it even. This is shown in a lot of her actions where it seems like she craves violence and she doesn't know when to stop sometimes. But then when you read her inner voice, her actual narration, it seems like sometimes she does it because no one else will. She knows the price of sacrifice and she'll do anything if it means that humanity and her loved ones can win the war and survive. Her preferred morph is the grizzly bear. Tobias is the 3rd person who narrates, and he already has a really tragic life before any of this alien bullshit comes into play. He's an orphan. He lives with either his aunt or his uncle, but they are from opposite sides of the family and they hate each other. He never knew his father. His mother died in a car crash when he was really young. So yeah, he's just living a horrible life. Jake saves him from getting his head dunked in the toilet, and that's literally one of the first moments of kindness that he experiences. Side note number 2, in these books, the morphing power that they get is explained as a technology, not as magic. So when Elfangor, that prince from earlier, when he gives the kids a morphing ability, he gives them this caveat. You must morph back to your human form within 2 hours of morphing into an animal, or else you'll be trapped in that animal's morph forever and lose the ability to change yourself back. Why do I mention this? Well, by the end of book 1, Tobias is trapped as a red-tailed hawk. It's a little bit tragic, but actually, is it tragic if he feels more free in this bird form, who can, fly around, ride on the wind thermals, just kind of live his own life instead of being stuck in a human life where literally everyone hates him? It's also implied that he chose to stay as a hawk. He just thought it would be better than what he was already experiencing. Over the course of the books, he has to come to terms with his identity as a hawk/human, and he kind of learns more about his family and his past. Rachel and Tobias sort of fall in love. It's kind of a Romeo and Juliet situation. Their words, not mine, but it makes a lot of sense within the story. Cassie's the next character, and I would say that she's most people's favorite character, if not one of their favorites. She is a self-described tree hugger, nature lover, and peacemaker, which is funny because she and Rachel are best friends. Also, Cassie has a crush on Jake, which is reciprocated. They actually do like each other, but it's very complicated to have these feelings and to express them when you're busy literally fighting for your lives every day. Because she is such a peace lover, the war is really hard on Cassie, and she just wishes there was another way to fight that didn't involve physical action. She's very empathetic, and in fact, she even helped start a Yeerk peace movement because there is a group of Yeerks who do not support Visser 3 and they don't want to take over Earth. Somehow, after the war, she kind of comes out of it fairly well adjusted, but her relationships with the other Animorphs are forever changed, and they never really have that close connection anymore. Side note number 3, if you want to add an animal to your morphing arsenal, you have to physically touch them to acquire their DNA. I mention this because Cassie's parents are veterinarians, which is also why she loves nature so much. So Cassie helps the Animorphs sneak into the zoo where her parents work, and this way they acquire a bunch of animals by petting them. Somehow they never get hurt, but there are a few very humorous scenes where they're running away from zookeepers or trying not to get bitten and disrupting people at the zoo. Her preferred morph is the gray wolf. Marco is the last human Animorph in the story, and he's my personal favorite character. I think it's because he kind of reminds me of Sokka from Avatar: The Last Airbender, mixed with Percy Jackson, which are two of my other favorite characters from children's media. As you can see, they're kind of similar. They're very sardonic, sarcastic characters, but with a heart of gold, and they always want the right thing even though they may not always make the best decisions. So Marco is Jake's best friend, which also makes him Rachel's worst frenemy. It's funny, it's a really interesting dynamic, but he's also the class clown, he's a science geek, he's the life of the party, he's a very outgoing boy. When we meet Marco, he's grieving the death of his mother, who recently drowned in a boating accident. So because of this grief, he's very reluctant to join the group. He doesn't know why Elfangor had to pick him. Why can't some other aliens come and fight off the Yeerks? Why can't he give the power to some other kids? This is not necessary. And I think he was asking the right questions. But when you meet Marco in his book, he actually finds out that his mother is not dead, but actually under the control of Yeerk. So now he's fully invested in the war because the fight is personal. At the end of the war, he kind of becomes this major celebrity because the Animorphs do reveal themselves to Earth and kind of explain how they saved humanity, how they prevented everyone from being taken over by the Yeerk Empire. So he gets to keep cracking his jokes, he's counting his money, he's buying cars. His life is turned upside down, but hey, depression can't hit a moving target, right? And I did forget to mention, but his preferred morph is a gorilla. So those are the 5 human Animorphs, and I did mention there were 6. So here's number 6. Ax, which is short for Aximili, is the younger brother of Elfangor. He also crash lands onto Earth very shortly after Elfangor does, but they don't know that each other is there. It's actually very sad. The humans find him in book 8, and that's his first narrated book. Ax has really been stuck in the spaceship in the ocean for a few months, and he's been sending out these signals for help. So the humans eventually do find him, and they have to explain what's going on, oh, why do you have morphing powers? What are you doing here? How did you get here? Etc. Ax can't exactly go home because his spaceship is destroyed, So he just decides he might as well join these human Animorphs. This means that they have to create a human morph for him, which is like a mix of all the other kids' DNA, and they don't really explain it, but let's just, believe that it happened. He sometimes uses this morph so he can pass off as a human, because otherwise he's in his like alien form, which I'll get to later. When he's not in human form, he hides out in Cassie's parents' barn, and he's trying to learn about society and just how do the humans compare to his people. He's doing all this while he's trying to honor his brother's legacy. And he doesn't always agree with the humans, of course, but they're the closest thing he has to any sort of family. And in his culture, family is everything. That brings me to side note number 4. Under his tradition, because his brother Elfangor was killed in battle, Axe is bound by honor to avenge him. So this makes his motivation for joining the Animorphs very easy in comparison to some of the other characters. So these are the 6 Animorphs, and they take turns narrating the books, which was in the order that I presented them in. Except it's kind of more complicated than that, because there's 6 characters, but they kind of narrate in groups of 5. So for example, Jake will narrate books 1, 6, 11, 16, and so on. Rachel will narrate 2, 7, 12, 17, etc. And the same for Cassie and Marco, they narrate every 4th and 5th book. But then Tobias only narrates every 3 out of 10 books, and Axe only narrates every 8 out of 10 books. So Tobias narrates 3, 13, 23, and Axe narrates 8, 18, 28, etc. So I think this is just making it sound more confusing than it really is, but if you're familiar with discrete math, you can think of it as a modulo function. If you don't know what that is, just ignore me. The order is Jake, Rachel, Tobias, Cassie, Marco, Jake, Rachel, Axe, Cassie, Marco, and repeat. The books kind of go in this narration order almost up until number 50 or so, I would say, and then after shit gets really real, the war is really ramping up, the narration order just kind of goes awry, but you don't really have time to worry about that because you need to know what is happening and if people are going to die or not. So I'll probably refer to some books as like Jake books or Marco books, which means that the book was narrated by them. Anyways, moving on from the Animorphs. Next are the aliens. There are a few major species of aliens that have very big roles in these books. So andalites are the first. We've already encountered some of them. Elfangor and Axe are andalites. So the best way to describe an andalite is that they are a furry blue creature. Their bodies are centaur-like, they have no mouth, they have 2 extra eyes, and they communicate through thought speak, which is written with these like brackets, basically just telepathy. Instead of a horse tail like a regular centaur, they have a giant scorpion blade as a tail, so they're very deadly. They can kill people with their tail. And because they have no mouth, they have to eat through their hooves, so they will like run through grass and eat the grass from their hooves. Andalite society is very hierarchical, so it's kind of like a monarchy but very military based. And so a lot of these titles that are given are based on honor, duty, or legacy. So for example, Elfangor was a prince, a war prince to be exact, and he was in charge of an Andalite army. So that's why he was fighting Visser 3 in the first place, and that's how he ended up on Earth. The Andalites are very technologically advanced. That's how they created this morphing technology, and they placed it into this morphing cube. And so this cube is what Elfangor gives the kids when he is like on his last limbs. The cube is like blue and glowing, kind of like the Tesseract. You have to touch the cube and then you'll acquire this technology. Elfangor gives the cube to the kids and instructs them to hide it away and never give out the power unless it's like really, really necessary, because it's very dangerous to, have this technology just out in the open. Later in the story though, the cube is taken away by the Yeerks, and this causes a very interesting domino effect that ultimately leads to the end of the war. So the Yeerks are next. I kind of already explained what they are, but I'll provide more context. Like I said, they are these very parasitic slug type aliens who connect to people's brains and manipulate electrical signals to take over their host's body. So they only gained the ability to like conquer different planets because one time in history, a nice andalite showed some kindness to them by giving them access to technology and higher knowledge. Before they had this, the Yeerks lived in darkness. They kind of swam around in pools, they were blind, and they have to eat every 3 days to live. Specifically, they eat these things called chondrona rays. It's kind of like photosynthesis, but they need this radiation so that they can fuel themselves. The rays were plentiful on their home planet, But once they got technology, they were able to like develop chondrona ray generators so that they could feast anywhere instead of just on their planet. And for a time, the Yeerks and the Andalites were friends because that one nice Andalite had given them technology. However, the Yeerks eventually mutinied and stole some ships from the Andalites and then started to invade these neighboring planets. And that's when their conquest of the universe began. So the Yeerks' ultimate goal is to find a planet with the best species to take over and just continue to expand their empire across the galaxy. So the hosts that they want to conquer must be intelligent enough for them to be able to like enact war and destruction and everything, but they also must be stupid enough to be controlled through the mind. And of course, humans fit the rubric perfectly. Like the Andalites, the Yeerk society is very hierarchical. So Visser 3, the big villain in this story, he is the top Yeerk in this conquest of Earth, but he also has a lot of superiors that he has to report to, and they ask him about his progress. And of course, that means some of the people that work under Visser 3 are just kind of doing it because they don't have anything else to do. It's almost exploring the theme of the banality of evil. Like, they're just doing their jobs. They may or may not be aware that their job is aiding this crazy, insane empire in conquering the entire universe. Another thing about Yeerk society is that the Yeerks individually don't really have identities. They are all just given a name and a number at birth, and I think it's like asexual reproduction. So for example, the Yeerk who is under the title of Visser 3, his actual name is Esplin 9466, and there's other Esplins with different numbers. The next species of alien is called the Hork-Bajir. At least that's how I call them. I don't know how they're pronounced. I never watched the original Animorphs TV show, but they might have pronounced it there. I don't know. Someone could fact check me. The Hork-Bajir are a species of vegetarians, but they're reptiles, and they have sharp blades all over their bodies. They were created by another species, the Arn, to harvest tree bark. So that's their original job. The Arn created them to be unintelligent, very passive creatures, but every so often a Hork-Bajir will be born as a seer, meaning that they're able to communicate and have higher level thinking skills. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but it's been widely discussed on Animorphs fan forums that this allegory is kind of ableist. Like, just thinking about the fact that sometimes a more intelligent member of your species is born and becomes the leader, I don't know, it's a little off. So the Yeerks like the Hork-Bajir because their bodies are very violent and deadly and like covered in blades, right? So they are great fighters, even though they are pacifists. Later in the series, there is a seer that is born, and the Animorphs encounter her. And this seer helps some of the Hork-Bajirs escape from the Yeerks and form like a free colony in a hidden valley in Yellowstone of the United States. And they kind of just live there until the war is over and it's safe to come out. And lastly, the taxons are these very giant worm creatures who have an insatiable appetite. They are also enslaved by the Yeerks because once they start eating, they just can't not physically stop. Once they smell blood or death, they will literally do nothing except devour everything within sight. So this can create some conflicts between Yeerk hosts and their taxon bodies because there's like a physiological need to eat, which can override a Yeerk's grasp on their mind. But they are good fighters because they just literally eat everything. However, the Yeerks don't prefer to be in a taxon body if they can because they're similar in structure. So they're both worms, they're both squirming around, there's a lack of sensation. It's just not the best host that you would want if you were a Yeerk. Those are all the main alien species. And now we'll talk specifically about the andalites because they are kind of one of the key players in the war. We've already met Elfangor. His death scene is very traumatizing. It's in chapter 6 of the first book, but it's very necessary for exposition. There's also a prequel about his entire life, which is told in one of the companion novels. It's called The Andalite Chronicles. I would highly recommend this one, even if you're not going to read a lot of the other books. I think this one is a great way to explain the backstory of how this war even got started and how he got to Earth. I can't summarize the whole book, but I'm going to give some main points here. So Elfangor fought Visser 3 way before the events of the original books, of course, but he kind of escaped from his original timeline. One day, Elfangor was on a space mission saving these two humans from being captured by like some mercenary group, and one of them he fell in love with, and her name was Lauren. He and Lauren actually decided to like defect from the war and move to California in the 80s. He makes his human form, he morphs into it and becomes a human man permanently and calls himself Al, and he and Lauren get married. And because he's an andalite, he knows like all of this advancement that allows Bill Gates and like Steve Jobs and like all of these big tech guys to create the internet and computers and everything. I mentioned that he and Lauren got married. They eventually had a baby boy named Tobias. Yes, our hawk boy. Shortly after Tobias is born, Elfangor is sent back to his original timeline by the Elamists, who is like this god in their universe. He's sent back to that timeline. He learns that he has a younger brother named Axe, and then Lauren gets all of her memories erased. So now she has a child, but she doesn't know who she had the child with. She doesn't remember her husband. She doesn't remember anything that happened. And this is also why Tobias had never known who his father was, because she didn't remember and then she died. So now Elfangor is back in his original timeline. He's like fighting. He tries to go back to the timeline where he has Tobias, and then that's when he crash lands onto Earth, and that's where the events of book 1, chapters 1 through 6 happen, and he dies. The next very crucial andalite is named Aloran, and he was Elfangor's superior in the war. So remember the mission where Elfangor was saving Lauren? Aloran told Elfangor to completely decimate a pool of Yeerks. There's some history with Aloran that I won't fully describe, but it's implied that he had made a lot of mistakes in his past and he was trying to regain his status in this Andalite society by leading these smaller missions. But Elfangor didn't agree with him. He didn't want to wipe out all the Yeerks completely, so he knocked him out. And when Elfangor knocked Aloran out, a Yeerk crawled into Aloran's head. And this Yeerk turned out to be Esplin 9466, who took over his body. And that was the first time an Andalite had become a host for a Yeerk. So now Aloran is under the control of Esplin 9466, aka Visser 3. And he's under his control for almost 25 years. Visser 3 takes over his body. He gains his morphing powers. He gains all this fighting ability, all the knowledge of the Andalites. It's actually insane. When Visser 3 later meets Elfangor again on Earth, Visser 3 is able to morph into a giant monster and just like Elfangor. Side note number 5, the layers to that scene are so complicated if you actually think about it. So imagine you're Elfangor and you're about to be eaten by the body of your former superior, but that superior is being controlled by a parasitic worm. But the only reason that they're being controlled by that worm is because you didn't want to kill hundreds of that worm. So you knocked him out, and then he got infested by the worm, and then you ran away for 25 years out of guilt. And then the first time you see his face again is when you're being killed by the same mistake that caused this entire thing to happen. Like, it's actually just crazy. At the end of the war, the Animorphs do free Aloran from Esplin 9466, and he helps them win over the other Andalites, because the Andalites kind of mistrust humans, and they are obviously astounded that a bunch of human kids could have stopped Visser 3. It is a little bit sad though, because when they free him, he kind of just begs the Animorphs to kill him instead, because he's already lived with this trauma for 25 years and he would rather die than become a Yeerk again, or just like have to live with what he knows. Zero is the next Andalite, and this is the Andalite that specifically gave technology and knowledge to the Yeerks. Because the Yeerks started their conquests of the universe, his generous act became known as Zero's kindness, and that became a cautionary tale in Andalite society to not always provide aid to other people and like kind of be suspicious of other species. So a lot of Andalites hate him for what he did for the Yeerks, and others feel pity for him. But all in all, they needed someone to blame for this unfortunate mistake, and he was the one that got blamed. The last Andalite that I'll mention is named Aldrea. She is Zero's daughter. After the Zero's kindness incident, the Andalites forced them to move off to a different planet, and this planet was inhabited by a bunch of Hork-Bajir. So Aldrea becomes friends with the Hork-Bajir. One specifically is named Dakhami, and Dakhami is a seer. So long story short, the Yeerks invade this planet and take over a bunch of Hork-Bajir. At the same time, Aldrea accidentally gets stuck in the Hork-Bajir morph, and then later she and Dak get married as Hork-Bajir and have a child. Their child is also named Siro after her father, but he's also taken by the Yeerks later and ends up on Earth. So I mention her because the fact that her Hork-Bajir son was taken to Earth becomes very important later.
Hey guys, I'm back. I actually recorded this a few weeks ago and then I realized there was no audio, so I'm re-recording it. So next I'm going to talk about the antagonists, and while most of the books do paint the Yeerks in a more negative light, I think it's important to say that not everything is black and white in this series. So I've already talked about Visser 3, but he is the big bad villain in these books. He's in pretty much every single book, if not all of them, and his ultimate goal is to conquer Earth for the Yeerk Empire. He is the only Yeerk to have ever gained access to an andalite, and because of this he is super powerful, since he also has all of the access to the morphs that Aloran had already acquired previously. But Visser 3 is also beholden to greater powers and higher ups in Yeerk society, and so this turns into some petty political beef that he has with people that he disagrees with. I would honestly describe him as a cartoon villain. He's kind of just there, and he doesn't really have any depth to him beyond being this like big bad person. In contrast, Visser 1 is an antagonist that I'm very intrigued by. So the Yeerk name for Visser 1 is Edris 562, and one of the companion novels, Visser, is actually all about how the Yeerks first came to Earth, and it's told through the framing of the Yeerk as being put on trial, and then she's like recounting her memories and her time on Earth. So I won't spoil everything because I think this is one of the more well-crafted books in the series, but I think it's important to still give you a summary. So Edris 562 landed on Earth in the 70s. She was sort of there to figure out if Earth was capable of being conquered and if humans were a suitable host species. She landed in a mysterious desert in the Middle East, and as soon as she saw American soldiers just like ruthlessly, mercilessly killing civilian people, she decided that humanity actually would be perfect for taking over. So then she slowly over time created the sharing, which is like a cult that allows chosen people to gain money or status by pledging their loyalty. However, when you pledge into the sharing, you're actually pledging into becoming infested by a Yeerk. The sharing worked very well because it was targeting these lonely people who kind of wanted to feel like they were a part of something, and so they built up this big community. Over time, Edris, because she was always in a human host, she actually fell in love with another Yeerk who was also infesting another human, and their human hosts had a child together, but they consider it like the Yeerk's children. Sorry, they had 2 kids together as human hosts. Later, after Edris takes over Marco's mother's body, her name's Eva, she later gets accused of treason, and then you find out that she kind of has beef with Visser 3 because she doesn't want him to do a full frontal assault on Earth, and it's because she wants to protect her own human children that she had while in a human host previously before Eva. Of course, there's a lot more detail in the actual book, but I think it is pretty insane, but also a must read. So next, the controllers are what the Animorphs call any creature or human or species that is a host to a Yeerk. So they are being controlled. There are both unwilling controllers and willing controllers, but the Yeerks prefer to infest specific types of species just because of the host species' abilities per se. In the books, the controllers are mostly taxons, Hork-Bajir, or humans. This makes for an interesting ethical debate because the Animorphs try not to kill the human controllers whenever they know that there's someone who is infested, but they never seem to take any liberties with the taxons or Hork-Bajir controllers, even though it's kind of a similar situation. But anyways, there are a few human controllers that I think are pretty significant to the plot. One of them is named Tom, and his Yeerk has some leadership duties, so his hosts Tom becomes pretty important in recruiting people to the sharing and to increase the Yeerk host numbers. But what is really terrifying about this is that Tom is Jake's older brother in real life. And Jake's looked up to him forever. They used to hang out a lot and play basketball, and, just they had a really strong brother relationship. However, before the events of the series, because Tom had been infested, Jake actually noticed that he sort of changed. He stopped hanging out with him. He had really gotten involved with this club called the Sharing. And so very early on in the books, Jake finds out that Tom is a controller. And I honestly think it's pretty scary and serious. Just imagine living down the hallway from pretty much your worst enemy for years, and you have to just conceal the fact that not only are you involved in this battle, you are also just a human child who somehow acquired the powers of morphing, and you're not actually an andalite, which is what the Yeerk army thinks you are. Also, that's your older brother, who you've known since you were born. Closer to the end of the series, Tom actually gets his hands on the morphing cube, and he gains the ability to morph, which really changes the tide of the war. So now, because he can morph, he's no longer restricted to Tom's human body. And there's kind of this rebellious movement that builds up within the Visser 3 army. They now know that they can be free, and they don't have to, be constrained to fighting in this pointless battle. When Tom finds out that Jake is an Animorph and not an Andalite, the Yeerk that is controlling Tom is so angry and almost kills Jake. He says something like, "This whole time you were living down the hall from me." It was pretty devastating. Another unwilling human controller is Mr. Chapman, and he just happens to be the principal at their school. But this is both good and bad, because by following him, they find out where some of the entrances to the Yeerk pools are, including one in their school. And they know that he's an unwilling controller because someone, I think Rachel, followed him down there and saw a Yeerk come out of his head to feed, and then watched as Mr. Chapman was basically struggling to break free, and he wanted to run out of the Yeerk cave and even begged the Yeerks not to infest his daughter and his wife. It was pretty haunting, especially because Rachel was friends with his daughter Melissa, so it was kind of like a breakthrough moment for her, where she realized exactly how much this war was taking a toll on people that she loved. On the other hand, there are willing human controllers, and one of them is named Taylor. She has thrown in her lot with the Yeerks because she thinks that they can all just work together and everyone can get what they want. So she joined the Yeerks because she had originally been this very popular athletic girl, and then she was badly injured in a house fire. And after the fire, everyone kind of stopped talking to her. They just looked down on her injuries and such. And she was cast away by society. So because no one in real life would talk to her, she turned to the Yeerks, and they promised her, you're going to regain all the power and status that you had before. Her Yeerk ended up being Visser 3's second in command, so she did gain power in that way. I don't think she has a huge role in these books, but she does torture Tobias multiple times in the series, trying to gain information about the Andalites, and they're actually quite sad to read. I would say she definitely violated the Geneva Conventions. She was just straight up torturing him. Next, we have allies with an asterisk, and I'll quickly go over these. I mentioned an asterisk because one of them ends up being a sociopath, but he is an ally in the beginning. So the first group of ally are the Chi, which are a bunch of intelligent androids who were created by a former extinct species called the Pemalites. The Chi look like humans, and they were actually invented to be companions to the Pemalites, who look like dogs. So it's dog and man best friends forever thing. And one thing to note is that the Pemalites were pacifists, so when they programmed the Chi, they made the Chi pacifists as well. So unfortunately, the Pemalites were destroyed, but in memory, the Chi put the essence of the Pemalites into wolves on Earth, and so that it kind of explains how dogs evolved in the Animorphs version of Earth. The Chi have actually been on Earth since the time of the pyramids, and then Marco discovers that one of his friends is actually a Chi because he spots him in Osprey form, flickering, and he realizes he's kind of a hologram. This friend is named Eric, and Eric actually knows a lot about the Yeerks because he's been on Earth this whole time. However, the Chee refused to fight because, again, they were programmed to be pacifists. They become very crucial allies because they know a lot about the inner workings of the Yeerk society, and the Chee can even infiltrate the Yeerk society without being infested. Later in the books, Jake does manipulate Eric to kind of break through his pacifist programming, and it's kind of a trolley problem situation where he makes Eric choose between the lesser of two evils, and Eric almost like curses him out for it, but in Jake's mind it's necessary for them to win over the Yeerks. Another group of allies are the Free Hork-Bajir. So if we remember Aldrea, Dak, and Zero, when Zero was brought to Earth as a Yeerk host, he eventually did have a child named Jerahami. They call him Jeremy. Jera was born into captivity, but he and his wife named Ket Halpak escaped with help from Tobias. So as a result, Jera and Ket named their child Toby after Tobias. Toby was actually a seer and the first Hork-Bajir to be born free from captivity. She ended up leading this group of free Hork-Bajir on Earth, and they became very vital in the war effort because of their fighting prowess. And lastly, now we get to the asterisk part of this group of characters. We have to talk about David. David is an ally who turned into a sociopath, and his story is told through several books, which are number 20, 21, 22, and 48. David is basically a random child who moves to the Animorphs town and accidentally finds the morphing cube. So earlier I mentioned that Elfangor gave the kids the cube. It's actually not 100% true. They left it in the construction site, but then David found it and tried to sell it online. And because of this, Visser 3 found it online and basically showed up at David's house and infested his parents, and then David ran away with the cube. So he finds the Animorphs, and the Animorphs are like, well, I think we have to let him join the team because otherwise we're just abandoning him to the Yeerks. So he joins the team, and the Animorphs now have the cube from David, so they actually do take measures to hide it away. At first, David's contributions to the team are very normal and helpful, but then things start to go south. He becomes resentful because the kids make him hide out in like the barn in the woods, and it's mostly because they don't want Visser 3 to catch him and then sort of reveal this entire operation that's going on. He gets really angry with them and starts becoming violent. He starts killing random animals, such as a hawk that he thinks is Tobias. He almost kills Jake, Marco, Axe, and Rachel. The Animorphs actually pretend that Tobias is dead because that way it's just easier for them to like sort of gang up on him and work out a deal with him, with David. But then it doesn't really work out, so what does David do? David takes over the identity of Jake and Rachel's other cousin, who is in the hospital after a car crash. Their cousin's name is Sadler, and he was supposedly there because he was in this long coma after a horrible accident, but then David just takes over his body and like pretends to like wake up, and then we never find out what actually happens to the real Sadler. And so at this point, because he's impersonating their like comatose cousin and he's already tried to kill their friends multiple times, they have to come up with a plan to sort of trap him. So Rachel forces David to morph into a rat and traps him in a box on this like mysterious island in the middle of the ocean. And you might be thinking, what happens to him there? We'll come back to that in a little bit. The last group of characters that I have is called the Architects, and that is because in the Animorphs universe, they are the closest thing we have to gods. The main god, which is supposedly on the Animorphs side, is named the Elemist. There is a whole novel about his entire journey called the Elemist Chronicles, and it really just details his past as well as how he came into this omnipotent position. I think it's also a must read if you're interested in these books. I will warn you now that there's nothing that you can imagine that is remotely close to what actually happens in this book. So to give you a taste, here's a short summary. The Elemist, whose original name was Tumen, was a gamer. He was playing this game against a rival gamer named Krayak. Krayak's goal was to destroy worlds across the universe, and the Ellimist's goal was to try and save them from Krayak. This rivalry went on for centuries, and eventually it turns out that two men created the Andalites and the Pemalites. Then he became involved with Earth, and this is where his story connects to the Animorphs. So I mentioned that they're playing a game. However, the game involves like actual real life galaxies and planets and such. So remember when I mentioned that Elfangor had dealt with some issues with escaping a timeline and trying to fix it? This was because the Ellimist interfered with his life. And later, the Ellimist also interferes with Tobias's life, which allows Tobias the power to morph again. One caveat is that Tobias can no longer be a human for default form. He has to be a hawk, but he can still acquire other morphs and turn into other animals. And at the end of the series, one of the Animorphs does die, and you get to read a conversation between this character and the Ellimists as they're dying. Additionally, Krayak becomes involved with David a little bit later in the series, and basically frees David from being trapped as a rat. This book where David returns is kind of confusing, and I don't really know how to describe it, but it sort of ends up with Rachel saying that she had to do what needed to be done, and it's kind of implied that she killed him. So essentially, the universe is ruled by simulation theory, and everything that has happened is because of this gamer rivalry between the Ellimist and Krayak, which I think does a number on the implications of this Animorphs universe, but there's nothing you can really do about it. So apologies because that section was really long, but now that we have a good grasp on the characters and the world building, we can move along to the next part. Now that we have been introduced to most of the characters, I think the most logical thing is to recount some of the most memorable moments from the series. When I say memorable, I mean that I can recall them fairly well, either because I was in shock from horror, I was astounded because it did not age well, I thought it was funny or ridiculous, or I was genuinely touched by something that happened or something that someone said, and may or may not have cried. I'm sort of using this section as a way to convince you to read them by showing you what parts that I loved or hated about it. These are in no particular order, and I'm recounting them from memory from my notes, so please forgive me if I do recount something wrong. There is an early book in the series where the Animorphs somehow sneak onto a plane in Flymorph, and it's because they have to travel to another state for a battle or something. But this was pre-TSA, so they morphed in the bathroom and then they just boarded the plane. However, in Flymorph, Jake gets swatted by one of the passengers, and then his body starts to gush out and his guts are bleeding over the airplane cabin wall. He almost dies, and his friends have to lift him from the wall of the cabin into the bathroom in Flymorph, and that way he can demorph in the bathroom. So side note number 6, which I can't believe I haven't mentioned, is that if you demorph back to human before you die as an animal, all of the injuries you sustain while you are in morph will go away. So you are practically invincible if you can step aside from the battle for a second to demorph back into human and then back into animorph. In one of Jake's books, he gets knocked out and his head falls into a Yeerk pool, and he gets infested by a Yeerk named Temrash. This might be his second book or even third. It's pretty early on in the series, but I was surprised that Catherine Applegate was already tackling the scenario as early as she did. It was very useful though for the plot because it showed that the Animorphs are willing to work together as a team and do what it takes to free their friend Jake. They tied him up in the woods for 3 days, and they tried to starve out the Yeerk that was in his head. The whole time, Temrash is in his brain yelling at Jake because he can't believe that a human child is an andalite warrior who has been causing so much chaos and whatnot. At the end of the 3 days, Temrash does crawl out of Jake's ear and dies, and it's pretty graphic. The whole time while Jake was tied up in the woods, they had Axe pose as Jake and just pretend to be him. Otherwise, his parents would have filed a missing child report. This was actually fun for Axe because he got to try a bunch of new human foods and he could taste because he now finally had a mouth. The Animorphs encounter a random guy at a psychiatric hospital who is like clinically diagnosed as delusional because he keeps talking about these slugs who are controlling people. It turns out that this guy is hosted by a Yeerk, but he has discovered that eating maple oatmeal will cause Yeerks to essentially act like they have ingested cocaine and then become addicted. It's really crazy because now the Yeerks are unable to mind control and are just like immobile in this person's brain. So because of this newfound knowledge, the Animorphs have this ethical debate about if it's okay to dump thousands of tons of maple oatmeal, ginger maple oatmeal, into the Yeerk pool and just watch the Yeerks like overdose. They ultimately decide not to do this, but now they've already collected boxes and boxes and boxes upon boxes of oatmeal, so now no one wants to eat it. Also, they realize that there is an entrance to the Yeerk pool in a local McDonald's, and the way to access it is by talking to the cashier and asking them if you can get a Happy Meal with extra happy. So that's just more evidence that McDonald's is secretly evil, if you didn't know already. I kind of talked about this already, but in Tobias' first book, he really has to come to terms with the fact that he's no longer a human kid and now he has to hunt to live. I thought his arc was really interesting because he already felt ostracized and different from other kids, but now he had something very explicitly othering about him. I also really liked the book because he and Cassie had a lot of good moments together because she was sort of guiding him through this process of self-acceptance and explaining that, you know, because you're a hawk, you just have to follow the circle of life, and hawks have to hunt to live and eat rodents and whatnot, and if you don't do this, you will die. The mice that you're eating, they also know that they will die, so it's okay. And although the way that I'm describing it seems kind of like brutal, I think because he just had a hard time accepting that, it was actually a good message for him to hear. There's a book where the Animorphs acquire an ant, or maybe some other insect with a colony, and they find themselves at battle with another colony, and they have to literally fight for their lives while trying not to succumb to the hive mind. So they talk about like resisting this pull from the rest of the ants next to them and like fighting to hold on to their soul basically so they can continue to make conscious decisions for themselves. It's actually very scary. And then after the battle, they like have like remnants of these dead insects all over them, and they're still thinking about like how close they were to just becoming one with the hive and not being able to think for themselves anymore. In one of the books, the Animorphs accidentally burned down Bill Gates's house. Accidentally, but it's on TV. Allegedly. One of Cassie's most touching books involves her making an agreement with this Yeerk that if she gives up her human morph and just sacrifices herself into staying as an animal, the Yeerk won't tell Visser 3 that the Animorphs are a bunch of children instead of andalites. So, you know, instead of negotiating, Cassie just agrees and chooses to become a caterpillar and just dies. I think it's very devastating because obviously her parents think she's missing, and Rachel's like mourning her best friend because she doesn't know how Cassie's supposed to just come back from that. She's stuck in a caterpillar morph. But luckily, Axe remembers that there's like a loophole in the morphing technology where if you morph an animal that goes through a natural morph, then the 2-hour time limit doesn't exist. So when Cassie goes into the chrysalis mode, she turns into a butterfly, and they're able to like track her down because I guess they knew where the caterpillar was, and they kind of tell her to morph back into human somehow. And then that Yeerk that Cassie made this deal with was so moved by this gesture that she agreed to defect from the army and then morphed into a whale forever, because her actual dream was to just swim around and she didn't want to like be restrained to the small Yeerk body that she was in. The next 2 books that I remember, I'm going to group them together because I think they're both kind of silly and goofy. One of them I call the Atlantis book because the Animorphs basically discovered this underwater civilization of fish people, and the fish people wanted to kill the humans there so they could preserve their bodies for like a museum. But what was funny about it was that they were like speaking French or something. I don't remember exactly, but they were like randomly in the ocean speaking French. The other book took place in Area 51, and allegedly the government was hiding some alien tech, So the Animorphs and Visser 3 were both trying to see if it was something that they could use for the war. And the way that they infiltrated was that Cassie got to morph into a horse. But then she ended up finding out that the technology was just an alien toilet. Another two books that I found very similar were the Polar Bear and the Kangaroo book. So the Polar Bear one I think took place in maybe Alaska or Canada, and the Kangaroo one was in Australia. It's a long story of how they got to Australia, but Cassie accidentally boarded a plane. She was in the cargo hold or something, and then she woke up randomly. I don't know. But the plots were almost identical, which is why I remember them. Marco was in the Polar Bear book, and Cassie was in the Kangaroo book. But in both books, as the animal forms, these two kids kind of protected some random indigenous community from a Visser 3 attack, and the people in that community thanked them because they thought they were animal gods. This could be somewhat problematic maybe, but I think it was at least cool and interesting to see two different indigenous communities represented in these books. It seemed like the one in the Polar Bear book was the Inuit, or based off of them, and then the one in the Australia book was the Maori. In one of the Rachel books, she is a starfish, and then she gets one of her starfish arms ripped off by a child in a touch pool, and because starfish can regrow their arms, she regenerates into two human Rachels when she demorphs, and they call her Mean Rachel and Nice Rachel. It's just really interesting but weird identity crisis because the Mean Rachel bullies the Nice Rachel, yet at the same time they're still both her, and they figure out that they have to electrocute her back together to fuse the two parts of her into one Rachel again. One of the Jake books that I really hated was told from the point of view of his ancestor named Isaiah, and he was narrating his life on the front lines of the Civil War, and he was talking about meeting these freedmen and soldiers and being surprised that black people were capable, which already sounds bad, but at the same time this book was telling a story about the Hork-Bajir and how sometimes one of them is born as an intelligent seer. So clearly they're trying to draw an allegory between the Civil War and white versus black men versus Hork-Bajir, and then the regular dumb Hork-Bajir versus the sometimes intelligent one. I think this is probably the worst book in the series, and I think most people will agree with me. I just don't think it's a good allegory. I think it's racist. I think it's ableist. I don't think it was necessary, and I don't know why they wrote it. There are a few companion novels where there's time travel. I think they're called the Megamorphs. And to be honest, I don't really remember all the details because they have no bearing on the overall plot. But in one of them, Jake dies. In one of them, they go to the time of dinosaurs. They learn that broccoli is from outer space. One of them, they travel to an alternate future where they're 25 and somehow the earth is desolate. There's even one where they kill Hitler. It's prematurely before he became a general. For some reason, they were included as companion novels, but I think it was more just to show what could happen in an alternate universe, because again, they had no bearing on the actual main plot. In one of the books, Jake is out on vacation or something, so Rachel takes over, and her leadership style is very fight first, ask questions later. So the book culminates with her flying a plane into a tower, and the reason I remember this is because I finished that book at 1 a.m. on a random night, but then I looked at my phone and it said it was September 11th, and I just had to sit there in silence because I could not believe my eyes. I don't remember a single other detail about the book except for that. There's a lot of moments that make me laugh near the end of the series, even though they're not supposed to be funny, and I think it's just because you realize that these Animorphs are still children and they're trying to deal with things in their premature preteen way, even though the things that are happening is just random bullshit beyond their wildest fantasies. There's a scene where Marco has to confront his father and tell his dad just get in the car, we have to drive or else we're going to be killed. And then he turns into a gorilla and his dad just has to be oh, okay, and follow him into the car. There's also another scene where Jake is talking to soldiers or something from the US Army, and he's like, I need you guys to evacuate the area because I have a bomb. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're a child. And he's like, no, please don't laugh. Like, I actually have a bomb and I can show you, and you need to leave now. It's not a laughing matter. If I can find the quote, I will put it here because it's just so ridiculous. The next one is probably one of the worst books next to the Isaiah one, and it involves the Animorphs going to a children's hospital and just giving morphing technology to a bunch of kids. Half of the kids are disabled from accidents, like a car crash or like they broke their leg or something, but the other half of them are like congenitally disabled. So it becomes this really weird thing because the half of the kids who were disabled from an accident become healed after they gain the morphing tech, because when you demorph, you lose any injuries that you had sustained. However, the other half of them are still just, how they were before because they were born like that. Regardless of this, Jake asks all of these kids to become his auxiliary Animorphs and have them fight in proxy battles whenever the real Animorphs can't be there. And they agree, and somehow their leader is named like James or John or Jack or something. It also starts with a J. But then every single child who was an auxiliary Animorph gets like horrendously killed in battle. Like, you never hear from them again after the end of the series. I think it's just a very horrifically ableist choice to do this, because it's somehow kind of implying that disabled people and disabled children are just disposable. Like, you can use them, and then when you're done using them, you're done. I think the majority of fans, and hopefully even the authors, agree that this was done poorly and they wouldn't do this again if they were writing it now. And the last few moments that I'm going to talk about are huge spoilers, but again, if you made it this far into the video, hopefully it doesn't matter to you. But in the last book, Jake tells Rachel to attack Tom, and then both Tom and Rachel die. Rachel's last view of her friends is through a TV screen, which is like projecting a video of her dying from poison. And the reason she was poisoned is because Tom had morphed into a snake and bitten her. At the same time, Tom is dying because Rachel had swatted him as a bear. She was only able to swat him because through this TV screen, Tobias was thought speaking to her and telling her where and when to aim, because he had hawk vision and he was able to see a little bit faster than her. And so she kills Tom kills her, they watch her die on screen, and that is literally the last time they see her. They don't even get to say goodbye. It's such a tragic and sad scene, and I was sobbing on New Year's Eve of 2022 when I was reading this, to the point where I had to physically put the book down to catch my breath. Also, this happens in like chapter 5 of the last book. So after you read this, I've already been on, this roller coaster of emotions, but I still have more to read. After that, the war ends shortly, and then Axe returns to the Andalite homeworld. But about 3 years later, Marco, Jake, and Tobias learn that Axe is missing, and they decide to set out on a mission to find him. Cassie has moved on by then. She doesn't want to be involved in any more of this Animorphs shenanigans, but she, wishes them well, and she is like still coping with her friend Rachel dying. The rest of them have become very estranged from each other. This whole war broke them apart. It's like really hard to maintain a friendship with someone where you watch them almost die every single day. However, Mirko and Tobias decide to follow Jake into space, and the last book of the series ends with them finding a mysterious spaceship, and the only voice that they hear from this spaceship is a creature that calls himself the One, but he has the body of their friend Axe. So something has happened to him. The last line of the book ends with Jake telling Marco to attack the spaceship that the One is on, and the series just ends like that, on a cliffhanger. Here I brought my panda plushie, and I'm wearing my panda shirt today, just to really lean into the Animorphs of it all. They don't actually ever morph into a panda in the series, but they don't have access to it, okay? They didn't go to the DC Zoo or the San Diego Zoo or whatever, so I apologize for the misleading shirt. I just really like pandas. So when we left off, I had talked about a lot of the memorable moments that I wanted to recount for you guys, But I think that if my goal in making this video is to actually inspire you to maybe pick up a book, I need to focus more on the big picture rather than the minutia. And so this section of the video is exactly about that. I'm going to talk about some of the most interesting themes, motifs, and even lessons that Animorphs tackled. And these, I think, were especially enthralling because the target audience of the books is 9 to 12-year-old children. So I think the most prevalent theme of these books is that it is a Bildungsroman, except the circumstances of this particular coming of age are pretty unconventional. We meet the children when they are in junior high. They spend many of their formative years, on the front lines of this war in their guerrilla army. And the epilogue in the last book takes place when they're like 19, in the late teens. These kids, from the very first page of the first book, are being forced to act beyond their years. And when you think about it, like, would you trust a 13-year-old with the task of defending the entire planet from a race of parasitic alien slugs? Because I'm not sure that I would. And I think it's really interesting to see how these children develop as they grow up with this double life that they lead, because they are animals, but they also are still just kids going to school. They have math class, they have English book reports to complete and turn in, they have friends and hobbies outside of that. But at the same time, they are fighting in this giant battle that extends beyond just their planet, and they're also completely aware that they are growing up throughout this whole process. And I think it's actually quite tragic what they experience. I think very related to this idea of a coming of age is that the characters in this story explore a lot of different avenues for self-expression and identity. This can be both implicit and explicit, but some of the examples that I can think of are characters like Tobias, who is literally struggling with what it means to be a hawk, but also an animorph and also sometimes a human boy, while at the same time having feelings for a human girl, Rachel, who is sometimes an animal. These kids have their own little personalities, they have their own hobbies, and they do have friends outside of the Animorphs crew that they do mention. For example, one of Rachel's best friends, Melissa, is the daughter of Principal Chapman. It's clear that they do have this whole life going on outside of the war, and you can even see how the war stunts some of that expression and identity. These children are constantly trying to figure out who they are beyond, stereotypes that are put on them by other people in their school or just like people around them, but also people who are in the same group as them, the Animorphs themselves. And also they're trying to break through these roles that they've put on themselves. So we know, for example, Rachel, she grapples a lot with everyone thinking she is just this like dangerous, brutal, vicious murderer. At the same time, Jake is like struggling with the fact that he is the leader of the Animorphs and he never asked to be. Marco is very pragmatic because he believes that the ends justify all the means, and he sees this clear straight line from point A to point Z. On the other hand, we have Cassie, who, she thinks that there must be a way to resolve this entire conflict without having to fight. She's a pacifist, yet she's still in this war. And then we have Axe, who is literally an alien, and he's trying to figure out a very delicate balance between, staying true to his andalite values and preserving his culture and traditions versus trying to fit in with human society and trying to learn the rules of this society from his human friends. This segues into another big theme, which is, of course, friendship and family. And I'm not speaking just about biological family here, but I think that is still a pretty big theme in the books. But more so the idea of belonging to something or to someone. And that could be belonging to your family group, your friends, or even to a group like the Sharing. I think that the relationships in the Animorphs books are very dynamic, and that is simply because the people in this book change a lot, the situations change a lot. There's a layer to the story about, who can you actually trust in this world, because placing your faith into the wrong person could literally get you infested by a yerk or even killed. There are things you can say and do. There are things you can't say or can't do. But sometimes you're forced to do things or say things that you don't want to, because it means that
it will keep someone that you love safe, and you want to protect the people you care about, even if it means that you're sacrificing your own beliefs and values for that. Another central question that comes up in these books is the question of free will or fate. And I know we talked about the alchemists before, which makes this whole situation much more challenging, because if the universe is a video game, then like what is the point, right? But I think that regardless of if the alchemist is an element in the story or not, there are several instances where the Animorphs children are having this inner turmoil about if they did the right thing or if they said the right thing, and how that might impact their future or, cause a butterfly effect. This definitely comes into play more towards the end of the books and the end of the war, because they are very aware that anything that they do could either save Earth or completely destroy it. And when Rachel dies at the end, she does see the alchemist, and she even asks him, like, did this all matter? Did I matter? I thought it was really powerful that he responded and he said, you did matter. What you did mattered, and you also as a person mattered. I thought that was a powerful message, because if I'm a child reading this and I'm hearing that, then maybe I'm coming away with the moral that it doesn't matter if we're being governed by destiny or if we, are able to choose our own path, but rather what we do and who we are is still important, and maybe it matters more than how we actually did that. So those were some of the themes that I thought were very pertinent and relevant in these stories, and those were more lighthearted, I would say. But I do really enjoy that Catherine Applegate, the author of this series, was not afraid to discuss more serious topics with these young readers. And of course, the discussions that were being had were not perfect, and I think reflect the times, which were the late 90s and early 2000s. But I think that the simple fact that she does talk about some of these topics is already pretty huge. So, for example, these books do cover and discuss the effects of racism, slavery, and to an extent, things like homophobia, transphobia, and just like othering and prejudice. The author makes an effort to write, what is considered diverse characters. So Cassie and Marco, they're explicitly children of color. Cassie's a black girl, Marco is a Latino Hispanic boy, and they do experience the effects of racism against them in the story, not necessarily by their friends, but by people around them in their society. I wouldn't say that the author really dives into this aspect of their identities super in depth, but it's definitely mentioned, which I think was very common at the time for, like a token diversity. There's also things like mentioning that Jake and Rachel may be Jewish, or they have Jewish traditions and celebrations. This was probably unconventional at the time and showed that like these characters are not necessarily following like the hegemony of like white Christianity in the US at the time. And we even have Tobias' story, which is coded as like a trans allegory. He's a human boy, he turns into a hawk, and he's like kind of struggling with accepting himself as well as learning to live his truth. And I know a lot of readers have resonated with that aspect of him feeling like he doesn't fit in his own body. So even though, some of these things are more explicit or more direct than others, the fact that there are discussions to be had about the writing, about these arcs, is definitely something that I don't think I've seen in a lot of other children's literature. And a bonus plus is that Catherine Applegate, even now, still stands behind those more progressive views and, in fact, has a trans daughter. So she is a very vocal ally and anti-racist, I would say, which is not something that many famous children's authors can say. Beyond just, exploring the effects of racism and homophobia and things like this, I think there's also a pretty scathing critique of imperialism and colonialism in these books, especially when discussing the Yeerk Empire. So remember in the book Visser, the Yeerk is literally landing in the ambiguous Middle East when she sees American soldiers basically just killing these helpless civilians. And that's how she decides that she is going to infiltrate and infest American humans to be her hosts.
Is that not a clear indictment of this country and the military strength and power and maybe the abuse of power that our governments use? Like, let's not forget that the core of the conflict in these books is that the Yeerks are colonizing and enslaving people to use their abled bodies and try to conquer the universe. It's drawing very direct parallels to, the military-industrial complex and how people's bodies are being taken by the government to do their bidding and to kill other people and conquer lands, in the name of America. It's all very grim and dark when you actually think about it. Lastly, I'm far from the first person to say this. In fact, I'm sure there's like hundreds of videos about this, podcast episodes, whatever, commentary online, whatever. But I think that overall, the core theme of the Animorphs series is to critique on war and its effects on society, especially on children. The Animorphs specific war involves the preteen kids, right, pretending to be soldiers and generals. But if you really think about it, aren't all wars fought by children? The US draft age is 18. That's a child. There's also discussions of resisting against oppression. The Animorphs are fighting in this guerrilla war against a very oppressive force that has taken hold of their institutions. The Yeerks have infiltrated their school, their police stations, their government. They are everywhere, and the Animorphs are fighting from the bottom up, basically. There's also a question of, like, who is right or wrong in a war. There are regular people with families and friends and loved ones on every side, and they could be Yeerks, they could be humans, they could be andalites. There are also Yeerks who rebel against their empire, and there are humans who willingly work with the enemy. And then there are even species that they don't seem to care because they don't think that the war affects them. I don't think any of these messages that the author is talking about are subliminal. I think that they're pretty directly discussed and mentioned throughout this universe. And it's not lost on me that Catherine Applegate was writing this series during the Bush administration, and the US was actually at war at that time. She also grew up with veterans. I think she probably saw with her own eyes exactly how war did a number on children and people just in general. And in fact, after she published the last book, she got a lot of pushback because there was no real happy ending to this story. I'm going to read her response to the criticism. Dear Animorphs readers, quite a number of people seem to be annoyed by the final chapter in the Animorphs story. There are a lot of complaints that I let Rachel die, that I let Visser 3 live, that Cassie and Jake broke up, that Tobias seems to have been reduced to unexpressed grief, that there was no grand final fight to end all fights, that there was no happy celebration, and everyone is mad about the cliffhanger ending. So I thought I'd respond. Animorphs was always a war story. Wars don't end happily, not ever. Often, relationships that were central during war dissolve during peace. Some people who were brave and fearless in war are unable to handle peace, feel disconnected and confused. Other times, people in war make the move to peace very easily. Always, people die in wars, and always, people are left shattered by the loss of loved ones. That's what happened, so that's what I wrote. Jake and Cassie were in love during the war, and end up going their separate ways afterward. Jake, who was so brave and capable during the war, is adrift during the peace. Marco and Axe, on the other hand, move easily past the war and even manage to use their experience to good effect. Rachel dies, and Tobias will never get over it. That doesn't by any means cover everything that happens in a war, but it's a start. Here's what doesn't happen in war. There are no wondrous climactic battles that leave the good guys standing tall and the bad guys lying in the dirt. Life isn't a World Wrestling Federation smackdown. Even the people who win a war, who survive and come out of the other side with the conviction that they have done something brave and necessary, don't do a lot of celebrating. There's very little chanting of, "We're number one," among people who have personally experienced war. I'm just a writer, and my main goal was always to entertain. But I've never let Animorphs turn into just another painless video game version of war, and I wasn't going to do it at the end. I've spent 60 books telling a strange, fanciful war story, sometimes very seriously, sometimes more tongue-in-cheek. I've written a lot of action and a lot of humor, and a lot of sheer nonsense. But I have also again and again challenged readers to think about what they are reading, to think about the right and wrong, not just the who beat who. And to tell you the truth, I'm a little shocked that so many readers seem to believe I'd wrap it all up with a lot of high-fiving and backslapping. Wars very often end, sad to say, just as ours did, with a nearly seamless transition to another war. So you don't like the way our little fictional war came out? You don't like Rachel dead and Tobias shattered and Jake guilt-ridden? You don't like that one war simply led to another? Fine. Pretty soon, you'll all be of voting age and of draft age. So when someone proposes a war, remember that even the most necessary wars, even the rare wars where the lines of good and evil are clear and clean, end with a lot of people dead, a lot of people crippled, and a lot of orphans, widows, and grieving parents. If you're mad at me because that's what you have to take away from Animorphs, too bad. I couldn't have written it any other way and remained true to the respect I've always felt for the Animorphs readers. I mean, I think what she said is pretty clear. She refused to cheapen the message that she was giving in the story by wrapping things up, just because it was a kid's story. And I think it's such a disservice to children to think that they are not smart enough to understand topics like this, because they are also living in this world with us. If we're truly trying to, invest in the future and reimagine a better life for ourselves, we have to start by giving children credit and realize that they can understand hard things. They don't need to be coddled when we're discussing serious topics like this. A lot of people question if Catherine Applegate would be able to write these books today, especially in a post 9/11 censorship political landscape. I honestly am not sure, but based on what she said and based on what I read in these 62 books, I think that she would stop at nothing to get her point across. Because just like she emphasized through the Elements, what we do and what we say matters, and it's important. To finally conclude this extremely long-winded, rambly video, I just have a few parting words, promise. First off, thank you so much for watching if you did finish this whole thing. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Animorphs universe and its very complex, convoluted plot, characters, moments, and themes. Second, I hope that there was something in this video interesting enough to persuade you to pick up even just one book, if not the whole series. I have my preferences, of course, but I think just picking up any book in the Animorphs series would make you understand just exactly why I had so much to say about it. Lastly, if you do feel inspired to read 1 or 10 or 54 or 62 of the Animorph books, I would love to hear about them. I think that there is plenty of material to be discoursing about even 30 years later, and I would love to continue having these conversations. With this news of a TV series being in production, I'm sure that there will be more discourse to come, but I would love to get it started before we see how they manage to adapt this world into a visual medium. So thanks again for watching. Like and subscribe if you want more videos. Maybe not exactly like this, but with the same amount of passion and effort put into them. And lastly, if you're Ryan Coogler or his team and you're watching this and you need help with the TV show, let me know. I am available for that. See you next time in La La Land. And I wish that there was a phrase that the Animorphs said when they demorphed, but they don't have that. So until next time.